In the 1950s, cars were considered a dream. If a car was new, it was good. If it was released, the engineers knew what they were doing. Spoiler, not always. It was in this decade that cars appeared that were already a bad idea. Not strange, not bold, just bad. They were bought, they were driven, they were suffered with. Some broke down faster than people got used to them. Some were uncomfortable from day one, and some didn't even understand why they existed. Today we'll look at the 5 worst cars of the 1950s, cars that frankly should have never been made. And before watching, support the channel by subscribing and liking. Thank you. And we'll start with a car that looked like a compromise even before you got into it. On paper, an idea. In reality, a problem. The 1951 Henry J was born from the right idea, but immediately failed. After the war, people needed cheap cars, and Kaiser Frazer decided to take advantage of this. The plan was simple: remove all unnecessary features, lower the price, and offer people an affordable car. On paper, it sounded logical. In reality, it turned out strange. The Henry J looked like a regular sedan, but at first glance, you got the feeling that something had been cut, and it wasn't a feeling, it was there. The base version didn't even have a trunk with a proper lid. You had to get out of the car to put anything in. To save money, they stripped out everything possible: minimal chrome, minimal trim, minimal amenities. The interior looked like a temporary solution that had been forgotten. Everything was simple, rigid, without a hint of comfort. And the problem was, people sensed it right away. The car didn't feel cheap and reasonable, it just felt cheap. Under the hood were weak engines that provided neither performance nor driving pleasure. This was especially frustrating on American roads in the early 1950s, as larger, more comfortable, and enjoyable cars were already available, and they didn't cost much more. Ultimately, the Henry J found itself in a strange trap. It was too basic to be desirable, yet not cheap enough to justify all the compromises. People couldn't understand why they'd buy a car that immediately made it clear they'd skimped on it. Sales were poor, interest quickly waned, and the model disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. The Henry J became an example that cost-cutting isn't always a plus. Sometimes, if you cut too much, a car loses its appeal altogether. The Henry J isn't the strangest car of the 1950s, but it's one of the most emblematic. It's a car that proved that cheap and bad aren't the same thing, but the line between them is a fine one. The 1956 Packard Clipper marks the moment when the once great brand began to lose face before our very eyes. In the 1950s, Packard was still remembered as a symbol of true American luxury. The problem was that the market had already moved on, but Packard hadn't. The Clipper was supposed to be a savior, more affordable, more mass-produced, more modern. In reality, it became a compromise no one asked for. On the outside, the Clipper looked respectable, but it felt odd. The car was trying to be both luxurious and ordinary. Not too luxurious to compete with Cadillac, and not simple enough to compete with the mass-produced brands. Ultimately, it was stuck somewhere in the middle, a place where there were almost no buyers. The interior tried to look expensive, but the cost-cutting was palpable. The materials, the parts, the assembly, everything suggested the brand could no longer afford its previous level of quality. And this is especially painful when the Packard name is written on the dashboard, which was expected to be something completely different. Under the hood, the Clipper was normal. And that's the whole problem. Nothing outstanding, nothing memorable. In 1956, normal was bad enough. Competitors offered more power, more comfort, more status, but the Clipper just went, without character, without emotion. The saddest thing is, the Clipper wasn't an outright bad car. It was simply out of place, too late, too cautious, too much of a compromise. It didn't solve a single market problem and offered no reason to choose it. The Packard Clipper became a symbol of the decline of a brand that once set standards and then began to play catch-up. This car isn't about engineering failure, but about strategic failure. It's about the moment when the name is still resident, but the content is already becoming empty. The Clipper is a reminder that in the auto industry, you can't dwell on past glories, because the market doesn't wait. It just moves on. The Willys Arrow 1955 was a car that tried so hard to look like a normal car, but never quite managed to convince the market it was even necessary. Willys was known for its military Jeeps, and that was precisely the problem. Making utilitarian vehicles, yes. Making a family sedan for civilian life was a completely different story. The Arrow was conceived as a lightweight, fuel-efficient, and modern car. It was indeed lighter than its competitors, handled well, and looked reasonable on paper. But in 1955, reasonable wasn't enough. People wanted big cars, powerful engines, and the feeling they were getting the most for their money. On the outside, the Willys Arrow looked modest, even too modest. No wow factor, no charisma. It was lost next to Ford and Chevrolet, which looked larger, flashier, and more prestigious. And here the Arrow immediately lost, not because it was ugly, but because it was inconspicuous. Under the hood were weak engines that didn't inspire confidence. The car drove, but wasn't impressive. It was passable for city driving, but boring for highway driving. And again, the problem. Competitors offered more power for roughly the same price. The interior was simple and honest, but too simple. The cabin didn't give the feeling of having bought something special. It was a car without emotion, without character, without a clear answer to the question, why do you need it? Ultimately, the Willys Arrow turned out to be a car out of its time. It was too cautious, too calm, and too modest for mid-1950s America. Sales failed, the brand couldn't compete, and the Arrow quickly disappeared from the market. The Willys Arrow was an example of how a normal car can become a bad idea. Not because it's terrible, but because it simply didn't make sense when it was released. The Saab 92 is a car that immediately feels different. And this was both its strength and its problem. Saab came to the automotive industry from aviation, and engineers viewed cars not as vehicles, but as engineering objects. And the market in the 1950s didn't want experiments, but rather simple and comfortable cars. Externally, the Saab 92 looked strange even then. Streamlined, rounded, with almost no distinct grille, more like a teardrop than a car. Aerodynamics were excellent, but most buyers didn't care. People wanted style, chrome, and status, not a wing-like shape. Under the hood was a two-stroke engine, lightweight, simple, but noisy and capricious. The car drove, but required constant attention. The smell, the sound, the handling, everything reminded you that this wasn't an ordinary sedan, but an engineering experiment on wheels. For enthusiasts, it's interesting. For ordinary people, it is tiring. The interior was the same, minimalist, practical, and utterly uninspiring. Everything was logical, everything was rational, but it felt like you were sitting in a dashboard, not a car. Saab emphasized reliability and handling, but forgot that customers also wanted comfort. Most importantly, the Saab 92 was too clever for its time. It offered solutions the market wasn't yet ready for. As a result, the car didn't achieve mass appeal and remained a niche product. It was respected, but rarely chosen. The Saab 92 isn't an outright bad car. It's a bad idea for the 1950s market. It's a car that proved that being ahead of its time is a risk. Sometimes people just want to drive, not figure out why things are designed the way they are. The Bond Minicar is a car that at first glance looks like a compromise, and from the first turn, like a risk. 3 wheels, a narrow body, and the feeling that they forgot to finish the car but decided to sell it anyway. And yes, this wasn't an experiment or a joke, it was a production car. The Bond Minicar's main feature was its single front wheel. It sounds unusual, but in practice, this meant instability, especially when cornering. The car easily lost its balance, and the driver had to constantly remember that physics wasn't a test of judgment here. Control required precision and sometimes just luck. Under the hood were small engines, most often motorcycle ones. There was almost no power, but even so, the feeling of safety was tentative. The Bond Minicar didn't drive, it moved carefully, hoping for a smooth road and smooth turns. Inside, everything was as simple as possible. Minimal space, minimal amenities, minimal everything. It wasn't a car for pleasure, but a means of getting from point A to point B when there were no other options, and that's exactly how it was perceived. The Bond Minicar existed not because it was a good car, but because it met certain conditions: taxes, licenses, and savings. Technically, it was a car. In reality, it felt like a cross between a car and a motorcycle with a roof. And that's the whole Bond Minicar. They didn't try to be comfortable, fast, or attractive. It simply existed in a niche where the demands on a car were minimal. Today, it looks almost comical, but back then, it was a viable choice for many people. That's where our list ends. Thank you for watching the video to the end. I truly appreciate it. If you enjoyed the format, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll be waiting for you in the next episode, where we'll continue to analyze the weirdest, worst, and most ridiculous cars in history.